The forgotten rose garden of Alderwick Manor. The road back to Alderwick Manor. The road to Alderwick Manor had always been quieter than Eleanor Whitmore remembered. Perhaps it was because she had changed, rather than the countryside itself. The lanes were still bordered by the same ancient hedgerows, where wildflowers leaned gently toward the passing carriage, and the same tall elms stretched their branches above the road, as though they had been standing there for 100 years, simply to watch the seasons come and go. The fields beyond the hedges remained untouched by haste, rolling softly beneath a pale autumn sky, their colours fading from summer green into the muted golds and browns that belonged to the final days of October. Yet as Eleanor sat inside the carriage, watching the familiar landscape drift slowly past the window, she felt as though she were travelling not merely through the countryside, but through a forgotten portion of her own life. The journey from London had taken nearly an entire day. It had begun before sunrise, when the streets of the city were still wrapped in a quiet grey mist, and the lamps outside the houses burned like small distant stars against the darkness. She had watched the familiar buildings disappear behind her, replaced gradually by open fields, small villages, and winding country roads that seemed to lead deeper into a world untouched by the noise and urgency of modern life. She had not returned to Alderwick Manor in 11 years. 11 years was a long time. Long enough for childhood memories to become softened around the edges, like old letters whose ink had faded slightly with age. Long enough for a garden once explored with curious footsteps to become only a collection of distant impressions, the scent of roses after rain, the sound of birds singing in the early morning, the warmth of sunlight falling across the stone paths. Long enough for a house to become almost a stranger. Eleanor rested her gloved hand lightly against the edge of the carriage window and looked toward the hills ahead. Somewhere beyond those trees stood Alderwick Manor, the home that had belonged to her family for nearly 2 centuries. It was where her grandfather had lived, where her father had been raised, and where Eleanor herself had spent the happiest summers of her childhood before life had carried her away to London. She wondered whether the house remembered her. It was a foolish thought, perhaps. Houses had no memories. Gardens had no feelings. Stone walls could not miss the footsteps of those who had once walked beside them. And yet, as the carriage continued along the narrow road, Eleanor found herself unable to dismiss the strange feeling that something was waiting for her. Not something frightening. Something quiet. Something patient. The driver, an elderly man named Mr. Collins, had barely spoken during the journey. He was a man who seemed to belong naturally to the countryside, with weathered hands and a face marked by years of wind and sunlight. When they had stopped briefly at a small village inn for tea, he had looked at Eleanor with a gentle curiosity. "You have not been to Alderwick in some time, Miss Whitmore," he had said. "No," Eleanor replied softly, "not since I was a girl." The old driver had nodded, looking toward the distant hills. "Then you will find that some things have changed." Eleanor had smiled faintly. "I suppose everything changes." Mr. Collins had considered this for a moment before answering. "Perhaps, but some places are very patient. They wait until people are ready to return." At the time, Eleanor had not known what to say. Now, as the carriage climbed the final hill, she found herself thinking about his words. The afternoon light had begun to soften when Alderwick Manor finally appeared. For a moment, Eleanor forgot to breathe. The house stood beyond a long avenue of trees, exactly as it existed in her memories, and yet entirely different from them. The great stone walls were covered with climbing ivy, its leaves turning deep shades of green and bronze beneath the autumn sun. Tall windows reflected the fading light, and the roof lines rose proudly against the sky, carrying the quiet dignity of a place that had witnessed generations of arrivals and departures. It was not a grand palace, like the houses of wealthy London families. It was something older, something warmer, a home rather than a display of fortune. The carriage slowed as it approached the entrance. Eleanor saw the front steps, the old wooden door, and the small lanterns beside the entrance that had already been lit despite the remaining daylight. Someone had been waiting for her. As the carriage came to a stop, the door of the manor opened. A woman stepped outside. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway. Even after 11 years, Eleanor recognized her immediately. The former housekeeper had grown older, of course. Her hair, once dark brown, was now silver, and there were more lines around her eyes than Eleanor remembered. But her expression remained unchanged, calm, kind, and filled with the quiet affection of someone who had known Eleanor since she was a child. "My dear Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Holloway said. Her voice carried across the stone steps like a familiar song. Eleanor descended from the carriage, and before she could say anything, the older woman reached forward and took her hands. "You have become exactly as your father hoped you would." The words surprised her. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "My father spoke of me." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. "More often than you know." For a brief moment, the wind moved through the trees surrounding the manor, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant flowers. Eleanor looked past Mrs. Holloway toward the house, toward the windows, toward the rooms where her father had lived, toward the place where she had once believed she would always belong, but now she had returned as something different. Not a child, not a daughter coming home after a holiday. She was the owner of Alderwick Manor now. Her father had left the estate to her after his passing, along with a responsibility she had never expected to carry. For weeks after receiving the news, she had considered selling the property. The manor required repairs, the gardens had been neglected, and London offered the comfort of familiarity. But something had stopped her. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps there was a small part of her that had always wondered whether the place she had lost could somehow become the place where she might begin again. Mrs. Holloway gently touched her arm. "You must be tired from the journey. Your room has been prepared." Eleanor smiled. "Thank you." As she followed the housekeeper inside, the great doors of Alderwick Manor closed quietly behind her. The sound echoed through the entrance hall. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply like the turning of a page. Inside, the house smelled exactly as she remembered. Old wood, polished furniture, beeswax candles. And beneath it all, a faint fragrance of roses drifting from somewhere beyond the walls. Eleanor stopped. "Are there still roses in the garden?" Mrs. Holloway looked toward the windows at the far end of the hall. For a moment, something unreadable passed across her face. "There are always roses at Alderwick, Miss Eleanor." The answer was gentle, but it carried the weight of something left unsaid. Eleanor looked toward the glass doors that led outside. Beyond them lay the garden she had not seen since childhood, the garden that had once belonged to her grandmother, the garden that everyone in the family had stopped speaking about years ago. And although she did not yet know why, Eleanor felt certain that her return to Alderwick Manor was not simply the return of an owner to an old house. It was the beginning of a story that had been waiting quietly beneath the roots of forgotten roses. The first night at Alderwick Manor was quieter than Eleanor had expected. She had imagined, perhaps, that returning to the house after so many years would bring a flood of memories, that every room would speak at once, that every corner would reveal some forgotten moment of her childhood, and that she would be overwhelmed by the presence of all that had been lost. But the house did not welcome her with noise. It welcomed her with silence. a gentle, thoughtful silence, like that of an old friend who understood that some reunions required patience. After supper, Mrs. Holloway had shown Eleanor through the familiar rooms, though everything appeared slightly smaller than she remembered. The great entrance hall, where she had once run freely as a child, now seemed more solemn, with its dark wooden panels and portraits of ancestors watching quietly from gilded frames. The long staircase still curved gracefully upward beneath the soft glow of the chandelier, and the same worn steps remained beneath the carpet where, many years ago, Eleanor had slipped while trying to carry a basket of flowers from the garden. She had almost smiled when she noticed the small mark in the wood. It was still there, a tiny imperfection in a house that otherwise seemed determined to preserve its dignity. "Your father never allowed that step to be repaired," Mrs. Holloway had said when she saw Eleanor looking at it. Eleanor turned. "He knew about it." The housekeeper smiled. "He knew about everything that happened in this house." There was affection in her voice, but also a quiet sadness. Henry Whitmore had always been that way. He had been a reserved man, a gentleman who rarely expressed his feelings openly, yet Eleanor had always sensed that beneath his serious manner was a heart far more tender than people understood. As a child, she had often mistaken his quietness for distance. Only later had she realized that some people carried their love quietly, showing it not through grand declarations, but through small acts that were easily overlooked. A repaired book left beside her bed, a favorite flower planted in the garden, a warm coat prepared before the first frost arrived. Things that seemed ordinary at the time, but became precious once they were gone. After Mrs. Holloway had retired for the evening, Eleanor remained alone in her room. It was the same room she had occupied during her childhood summers. The same pale curtains moved gently beside the window. The same wooden writing desk stood beneath the wall. The same small fireplace waited patiently for the cold nights ahead. Yet the room carried a different feeling now. When she was young, it had been a place of excitement and imagination. She had hidden beneath the blankets, reading stories long after she was supposed to be asleep. She had kept pressed flowers between the pages of her books and written letters to herself about the adventures she intended to have when she grew older. Now, standing there as a woman of 28, she felt the strange tenderness of returning to a place that knew an earlier version of herself. She walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the grounds of Alderwick Manor stretched into darkness. The moon had risen above the trees, casting a silver glow over the lawns and pathways. The garden walls were barely visible in the distance, covered by shadows and climbing vines. But even from her window, Eleanor could see the outline of the rose garden, the old garden, the one her grandmother had loved. She remembered it now more clearly than she expected. She remembered mornings when the air smelled of fresh earth and roses. She remembered her grandmother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, walking carefully between the flower beds with a small pair of gardening scissors in her hand, always stopping to examine each bloom as though every flower had its own personality. Plants remember kindness, her grandmother had once told her. Eleanor had been 8 years old at the time. She had asked, quite seriously, "How can flowers remember?" Lady Margaret had smiled. "They remember because they grow differently when they are cared for." At the time, Eleanor had thought it was simply something old people said. Now, years later, she wondered if her grandmother had meant something more. Perhaps gardens remembered people in the same way houses did. Perhaps they carried traces of those who had loved them. The following morning, Eleanor woke before sunrise. She had expected to sleep poorly, in an unfamiliar place, but instead she had rested deeply, as though the house itself had quietly accepted her presence. When she dressed and came downstairs, the manor was already awake. A fire burned softly in the breakfast room, and the scent of fresh tea filled the air. Mrs. Holloway had prepared a simple meal, knowing Eleanor had never been fond of extravagant breakfasts. "You remembered," Eleanor said with a small smile as she looked at the table. Mrs. Holloway looked surprised. "Remembered what?" "That I prefer tea before anything else." The older woman smiled. "My dear, there are some things that are not easily forgotten." The words lingered with Eleanor. Not easily forgotten. After breakfast, she decided to explore the house properly. There was much to be done. The estate needed attention, and she had already arranged for several repairs to begin in the coming weeks. But before making decisions about the future of Alderwick Manor, she wanted to understand its past. She walked through the library first. The room was one of her favorite places as a child. Tall shelves covered every wall, filled with books collected by generations of Whitmores. The curtains were slightly faded, and dust rested lightly upon the unused corners, but the room still possessed a quiet grandeur. Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines of old volumes. History, poetry, botany, travel journals, books that had belonged to people who were now only names written in family records. On the large desk near the window, she found something unexpected. A small notebook. It was bound in green leather, with edges worn from years of use. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her grandmother's. Eleanor hesitated before opening it. There was something deeply personal about reading words written by someone who could no longer explain them. A diary was not simply a collection of thoughts. It was a place where a person had once been entirely honest. She opened the first page. The entry was dated nearly 40 years earlier, April 17th. "The roses have survived another winter. I have always believed that flowers understand more than we give them credit for. They endure storms, they lose their petals, and yet when spring returns, they begin again." Eleanor read the words slowly. The same belief, the same garden, the same roses. She turned another page. There were many entries about the garden, about seasons, about flowers, about memories. But there were also small references that caught her attention. A name she did not recognize. A place she had never heard mentioned. A sadness hidden between ordinary sentences. Then, near the middle of the notebook, she found an entry that made her pause. The garden must never be allowed to disappear. Not because it contains flowers, but because it contains the truth of those who came before us. Eleanor looked up from the page. The room suddenly felt different. The quiet library, the old books, the distant ticking of the clock. Everything seemed to hold a secret. She closed the notebook carefully. For years, she had believed Alderwick Manor was simply an inheritance left behind by her father, a responsibility, a burden. A house she needed to decide whether to keep or sell. But now, standing among the books and memories of those who had lived before her, Eleanor began to wonder whether the manor had brought her back for another reason. Perhaps there was something here she had not yet discovered. Something her family had left unfinished. Something waiting beneath the soil of the old rose garden. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the quiet corridors once more, she noticed a door at the end of the eastern passage. She had forgotten it completely. The wooden frame was older than the others, and the brass handle had darkened with age. When she touched it, she felt a strange familiarity. Beyond that door was the garden, the forgotten rose garden of Alderwick Manor. For a moment, Eleanor stood perfectly still. The house was silent around her, but somewhere beyond the door, carried faintly by the autumn wind, came the scent of roses. And for the first time since returning home, Eleanor felt that Alderwick Manor was not merely waiting for her to remember it. It was waiting for her to discover something it had kept hidden. The door at the end of the eastern passage had remained untouched for many years. Eleanor could tell this even before she turned the handle. There was a quiet stillness about it, the kind of stillness that belonged to things forgotten rather than abandoned. Dust had gathered along the edges of the frame, and the brass handle had lost much of its original shine. Yet there was something graceful about the old door, as though it had been waiting patiently rather than neglected. For several moments, Eleanor stood before it without moving. She had spent the previous evening thinking about the garden, about her grandmother's words, and about the strange feeling that had followed her since arriving at Alderwick Manor. She had always believed memories belonged only to people, that they lived inside the minds of those who had experienced them. But perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps memories could remain in places as well. In old rooms, in worn wooden floors, in gardens where flowers continued to bloom long after the hands that planted them had disappeared. She slowly turned the handle. The door opened with a soft sound. Beyond it was a narrow passage leading outside. The morning air entered immediately, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Eleanor stepped forward, and the door closed quietly behind her, leaving the warmth of the house behind. The garden lay before her. For a moment, she simply stood there. The first thing she noticed was not what had changed. It was what had remained. The stone pathway was still there, although nature had reclaimed much of it. Small plants had grown between the cracks, and moss covered the edges where careful footsteps had once passed. The tall brick walls surrounding the garden were weathered by time, their surfaces softened by climbing ivy and years of rain. Beyond the walls, the world seemed distant. The sounds of the manor faded away. There were no servants moving through corridors, no carriage wheels along the road, no reminders of the responsibilities waiting inside. Only the garden, only the quiet breathing of nature. Eleanor walked slowly along the path. The garden was not Thur. When she was a child, it had been a place of Calloo. Now, many of the tule. Some rose bushes had grown wild, their branches twisting to death. And yet, despite all this, the tule, it felt asleep. As though it were waiting for Eleanor reached out, and it was small, imperfect. Its colour had fifth, but it was blooming. You! She did not know why. Perhaps because, in that perhaps she was. For years, life. But the rose in her hand seemed to. Some things weigh, some things survived. A sound came, the gentle scrape of a tool against hair. Eleanor turned. Near the far, she had not haze. He stood with his back. He wore a simple brown, for a mum, good morning. The man turned. His expression showed surprise, but not alarm. Good morning, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor paused. You know who I am? He placed the pruning shears down. Yes. His answer was simple, almost too simple. I am sorry, Eleanor said. I did not realize anyone was working here. The man looked around the garden. Someone should be. There was no criticism in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact. Eleanor studied him. And you are? Thomas Ashcombe. He offered a small bow. I have been looking after the grounds at Alderwick for the past several years. Eleanor looked toward the garden. Looking after them? Thomas followed her gaze. The overgrown paths, the forgotten flowers, the silent fountain. A faint smile appeared on his face. I suppose it depends on how one defines looking after something. His words surprised her. She expected an apology, an explanation. Instead, he seemed almost protective of the garden. I was told the garden had been neglected, Eleanor said. It has. Thomas did not deny it. But neglected does not mean forgotten. The sentence stayed with her. She looked at him carefully. There was something unusual about Thomas Ashcombe. He was not like the gentleman Eleanor had known in London, who often filled conversations with opinions and ambitions. He seemed more comfortable listening than speaking, as though he had learned from years spent among things that grew quietly. I found my grandmother's journal yesterday, Eleanor said. At this, Thomas's expression changed slightly. Lady Margaret's? Yes. He looked toward the roses. She loved this garden. She did. Eleanor walked closer to the old flower beds. She wrote that the garden must never disappear. Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he said softly, "She was right." The answer was unexpected. Eleanor looked at him. "You knew my grandmother?" Thomas nodded. "Not well. I was young when she was still here. My father worked on the estate before me. He taught me everything I know about these grounds." He touched the branch of the rosebush beside him. "Your grandmother believed every garden had a story. She said people often looked at flowers and saw only beauty, but they forgot that beauty usually came after years of patience." Eleanor smiled faintly. That sounds exactly like something she would say. Thomas looked at the garden again. She spent many years creating this place, and then it was left. Yes. The quietness of his response made Eleanor hesitate. There was something behind that simple word, something unspoken. What happened? Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the old stone bench beneath the apple tree and brushed away a layer of fallen leaves. Some gardens become difficult to visit after certain memories are attached to them. Eleanor understood. She thought of her father. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of all the conversations that had never happened because people assumed there would always be more time. "I suppose that happens to houses too," she said. Thomas looked at her. Yes. The two of them stood quietly among the roses. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that appeared between people who understood something without needing to explain it. A gentle breeze moved through the garden, carrying the scent of flowers and earth. Eleanor looked around once more. For the first time since arriving at Alderwick Manor, she did not see a neglected garden. She saw possibility. "There is so much work to do," she said. Thomas nodded. "There is. Can it be restored?" He looked at the roses, then at the old paths, then back at Eleanor. "Yes." His answer came without hesitation, but not all at once. She smiled slightly. "No? No." Thomas picked up his gardening shears. A garden does not return to life because someone commands it to. It returns because someone cares for it every day. The words were simple, but Eleanor felt them deeply, perhaps because she knew what it was like to appear fine while quietly withering inside, perhaps because she understood what it meant to need patience. The afternoon passed slowly. Thomas showed her the parts of the garden that still survived, the rose bushes planted by her grandmother, the old apple trees that continued to bear fruit each autumn, the small wooden gate hidden behind ivy which led to a meadow beyond the garden walls. Eleanor listened. She asked questions, and for the first time in many months, she found herself forgetting the worries that had followed her from London. The estate, the decisions, the uncertainty of the future, all of it seemed distant. Here, Among the roses and autumn leaves, she felt something she had not expected to feel: peace. When Eleanor finally returned to the manor that evening, the sky had turned soft gold above the trees. She looked back once before entering the house. The garden remained quiet, still imperfect, still waiting, but no longer forgotten. And somewhere beneath the tangled branches and sleeping roots, Eleanor felt certain that Alderwick Manor had begun to awaken. The days that followed Eleanor Whitmore's first visit to the rose garden passed with a gentleness she had almost forgotten existed. In London, her mornings had always begun with movement: the sound of carriage wheels along the streets, the distant voices of people hurrying through their days, the endless rhythm of appointments, letters, conversations, and obligations. Even moments of rest had seemed to carry a quiet expectation, as though every hour needed to be filled with some purpose. But at Alderwick Manor, time moved differently. The mornings arrived slowly. The sunlight entered the rooms gradually, spreading across the wooden floors in pale golden shapes. The birds began their songs before the servants had finished lighting the fires. The mist lingered over the lawns, resting gently upon the grass, until the warmth of the day persuaded it to disappear. And every morning, after breakfast, Eleanor found herself walking toward the garden. At first, she told herself she was merely observing. The estate required attention after all. She needed to understand the condition of the grounds before making any decisions about repairs. It was only practical that she should learn what needed to be done. But after several days, she could no longer pretend that practicality was the only reason. She went because the garden had begun to feel like a place where she could breathe. Thomas Ashcombe always arrived before her. Eleanor noticed this on the first morning she joined him. When she stepped through the old stone doorway, carrying a small basket of tools that Mrs. Holloway had found in the garden shed, Thomas was already there. He was kneeling beside one of the oldest rose bushes, carefully removing the damaged branches with the patience of someone performing a delicate restoration rather than ordinary work. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." He looked up as she approached. "Good morning, Mr. Ashcombe." She glanced at the rose bush. "Have you been here long?" Thomas looked toward the sky, as though measuring the morning by the position of the sun. "Long enough." Eleanor smiled. "That is not a very precise answer." "No. Do you often give answers like that?" "Sometimes." She looked amused. "And when do you give proper answers?" Thomas considered the question. "When they are needed." It was the sort of response that would have irritated her from almost anyone else. Yet from Thomas, it seemed natural. He did not speak to impress. He did not speak to control the conversation. He simply spoke when he believed words were useful. Eleanor found that strangely refreshing. The restoration of the garden began with small things. There were no grand changes, no dramatic transformation. Thomas explained that gardens, like people, could not be forced into becoming something new overnight. "The first mistake people make," he told Eleanor one morning as they cleared weeds from an old flower bed, "is trying to rebuild before understanding what remains." Eleanor looked at the tangled roots beneath her hands. "And what remains?" Thomas smiled slightly. "That is what we are learning." Together, they uncovered forgotten pieces of the garden. An old stone border hidden beneath years of growth. A pathway that had almost disappeared beneath fallen leaves. A small wooden arch covered in climbing roses that still produced a handful of delicate flowers each summer. Each discovery felt like finding a letter written by someone long gone. The garden had not vanished. It had simply been waiting. As the weeks passed, Eleanor learned the quiet language of plants. She learned that roses needed pruning, not because their old branches were worthless, but because removing what was damaged allowed new growth to appear. She learned that certain flowers preferred morning sunlight, while others flourished in the shade. She learned that some trees grew stronger because their roots had endured difficult conditions. Thomas never rushed his explanations. He did not teach her like a tutor instructing a student. He taught her like someone sharing a secret. One afternoon, while they sat beneath the old apple tree during a brief rest, Eleanor watched him examine a small flowering plant growing near the path. "You always seem to know what a plant needs," she said. Thomas looked down at the leaves. "Not always." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You seem very certain most of the time." "I notice things." "What things?" He gently touched the edge of one leaf. "When a plant begins to struggle, when the soil changes, when the weather affects it, small signs." Eleanor looked across the garden. "And people?" Thomas looked at her. "What about people? Can they be understood in the same way?" For a moment, he did not answer. The wind moved softly through the branches above them. Then he said, "Perhaps, perhaps, yes." He looked back toward the garden. "But people are more complicated. They often hide the things that plants show honestly." The words remained with Eleanor long after the conversation ended, because she knew he was right. For years, she had hidden her own struggles beneath good manners and careful expressions. She had smiled when expected. She had remained composed when others depended on her. She had accepted disappointments quietly, because she believed that was what a respectable woman should do. But the garden did not pretend. A damaged branch did not apologize for needing attention. A flower did not feel ashamed because it had lost petals. A tree did not believe winter meant it had failed. Nature simply accepted each season for what it was. One morning, Eleanor found Thomas standing beside the oldest rosebush in the garden. It was the same rose she had touched on her first day, the one small flower that had survived among the tangled branches. "Is it the same one?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Yes. It survived all this time. Yes." She looked at the rose carefully. "How?" Thomas smiled. "Because survival is not always about being untouched." Eleanor was quiet. He continued. "Sometimes surviving means being damaged and still finding a way to grow." The garden seemed unusually still at that moment. The birds were quiet. The breeze had softened. And Eleanor felt the words settle somewhere deep within her. She thought of her father, of her grandmother, of the years she had spent believing that returning to Alderwick meant facing everything she had lost. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps returning was not about recovering the past. Perhaps it was about making peace with it. By the beginning of November, the garden had begun to change. Not dramatically. Not enough that a stranger passing by would immediately notice. But Eleanor noticed. The paths were clearer. The rose bushes had been carefully shaped. The old fountain had been cleaned, and although it no longer carried water, it no longer looked forgotten. The garden had begun to breathe again, and so had she. Mrs. Holloway noticed the difference as well. "You seem happier," the housekeeper said one evening while preparing tea. Eleanor looked surprised. "Do I?" "Yes." The older woman smiled. "You laugh more." Eleanor looked down at her cup. "I suppose I do. Mr. Ashcombe has been good for this place." Eleanor glanced toward the window. Outside, the last light of the afternoon rested upon the garden. "He has." Mrs. Holloway studied her carefully. "He understands things that others overlook." Eleanor smiled faintly. That seems to be his greatest talent. No, Mrs. Holloway replied gently. I think his greatest talent is reminding people that they are not finished simply because they have been through difficult seasons. Eleanor looked at her. The words were simple, but they felt important. Winter approached Alderwick Manor quietly. The leaves fell from the trees. The mornings became colder. The roses slowly closed themselves beneath the frost. Yet Eleanor no longer saw winter as an ending. She began to understand what Thomas had always known. Every season had its purpose. Summer brought abundance. Autumn brought reflection. Winter brought rest. And spring, when it finally arrived, would bring renewal. The garden had taught her something that no book, no conversation, and no advice could have given her. Healing was not about pretending the past had never happened. It was not about cutting away every memory that caused pain. It was about allowing those memories to exist, while still making room for something new to grow. One evening, as Eleanor stood beside the old stone wall, watching the first snow begin to fall, Thomas joined her. The garden will sleep now, he said. Eleanor looked at the roses covered gently beneath white frost. Will it return? Thomas looked at her. Yes. How do you know? Because, he thought, some things were certain. But he only said, because it always has. And as snow settled quietly over Alderwick Manor, Eleanor felt something she had not felt since childhood, a sense of belonging. Not because the house had restored the past, not because every unanswered question had been solved, but because, somewhere among the roses and the seasons, she had begun to find her place again. Winter came gently to Alderwick Manor. It did not arrive with storms or harsh winds, but with a quiet transformation that seemed almost deliberate. The gardens rested beneath a thin blanket of frost each morning. The trees stood bare and graceful against the pale sky, and the paths that Eleanor and Thomas had spent weeks restoring became silver with ice before the sun had fully risen. The rose garden had changed. During the warmer months, it had been a place of movement and discovery, filled with the sound of footsteps, the turning of soil, and the careful work of restoring what time had hidden. Now it had become a place of stillness. Yet Eleanor had learned that stillness did not mean emptiness. The garden was resting, waiting, preparing for another season. She often walked there in the early mornings, wrapped in a wool coat, watching her breath disappear into the cold air. She no longer saw the garden as something broken that needed to be repaired. She saw it as something living, something that had survived many years without losing its ability to begin again. Thomas had been right. A garden could not be hurried, and perhaps neither could a heart. The discovery came on an unusually quiet afternoon. The snow from the previous week had begun to melt, revealing patches of dark earth beneath the old rose bushes. Eleanor had gone into the garden alone that morning, carrying a small notebook where she had begun recording the changes they had made. It had become a habit. She wrote down the names of flowers that survived the winter, the places where new shoots appeared, and small observations about the garden that she believed her grandmother would have appreciated. Near the oldest rose bush, the one that had bloomed despite years of neglect, she noticed something unusual. A small section of earth beside the stone border had shifted. At first, she thought it was simply the result of the frost. But when she knelt down, she saw the corner of something beneath the soil. Not a root. Not a stone. Something made by human hands. Carefully, Eleanor brushed away the earth. A small wooden box appeared. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She did not know why. Perhaps because she already felt that whatever was hidden there had been waiting for her. The box was old. its surface darkened by time, but it had been carefully protected from the elements. A small brass clasp held it closed. For several moments, Eleanor simply looked at it. The garden around her was completely silent. The winter sky stretched above the walls, pale and endless. Then, with careful fingers, she opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each one tied together with a faded blue ribbon, and on the top envelope was written a name she recognized immediately: Margaret Whitmore, her grandmother. Eleanor carried the box back to the manor. She did not open the letters immediately. Instead, she placed them on the desk in the library and sat quietly for several minutes. There was something deeply personal about what she held. A person's letters were different from their possessions. A painting could be admired. A piece of jewelry could be inherited. A house could be passed from one generation to another. But letters contained something more fragile: thoughts, fears, dreams, the private moments of a person's heart. Eleanor thought of her grandmother as she remembered her, a woman of dignity, a woman of kindness, a woman who had seemed to understand everything. But perhaps that had only been the version of her that the world was allowed to see. Perhaps everyone carried stories that remained hidden. Slowly, Eleanor untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated 43 years earlier. My dearest Thomas. Eleanor stopped. Her eyes remained on the name, Thomas. For a moment, she thought of the man who had spent the past months restoring the garden beside her. But this could not be him. This letter was written decades before he was born. She continued reading. The handwriting was elegant and careful. My dearest Thomas, when I walked through the garden this morning, I found the first rose of spring had opened. I thought of how often you told me that flowers never hurry, that they simply wait for the right moment to reveal what they have always carried within them. Eleanor read slowly. The words were gentle, beautiful, but there was a sadness beneath them. She turned to the next letter, then another, and gradually a story began to appear, a story that no one in her family had ever spoken about. Her grandmother, Lady Margaret Whitmore, had once loved someone deeply. His name was Thomas Elwood. He was not a wealthy gentleman. He did not belong to one of the great families of England. He was a botanist and gardener who had travelled widely, studying plants from distant countries and bringing rare seeds back to England. He had been the person who helped Margaret create the rose garden at Alderwick, not as a servant, not as an employee, but as someone who shared her belief that gardens were living histories. They had dreamed together, they had planned a future, but society, family expectations, and circumstances had separated them. Margaret had remained at Alderwick Manor. Thomas Elwood had left England, and the garden had become the only place where their memories remained together. Eleanor read until the afternoon light faded. The fire in the library had burned low, but she hardly noticed. She felt as though she had discovered a hidden room inside her grandmother's life, a room no one had ever entered. The following morning, Eleanor found Thomas Ashcombe near the greenhouse. She hesitated before approaching him. There was something about the discovery that she wanted to understand. Something that connected the past and present in a way she could not explain. Thomas? He turned. Miss Whitmore. She held the old letter carefully. Have you ever heard of someone named Thomas Elwood? The change in his expression was immediate. Not shock, not surprise. Recognition. Yes. Eleanor looked at him. You know the name? Thomas nodded slowly. My father spoke of him. Your father? He worked here when Lady Margaret was alive. The cold morning air seemed suddenly quieter. What did he say? Thomas looked toward the garden. He said Mr. Elwood was the finest gardener Alderwick had ever known. Eleanor looked down at the letter in her hand. He was more than that. Thomas waited. My grandmother loved him. There was no judgment in his face, only understanding. I thought that might be so. Eleanor looked surprised. You knew. Not the details. He paused. But some things are difficult to hide from a garden. The answer reminded Eleanor of her grandmother's words. Plants remember kindness. She looked toward the rose bushes covered in frost. Why did no one tell me? Thomas was quiet. Perhaps because people sometimes believe protecting someone from the past means keeping them away from it. But the past does not disappear. No. His voice was gentle. It only waits. That evening, Eleanor continued reading the letters. She discovered that her grandmother had never forgotten Thomas Elwood, but she also discovered something else. Her grandmother had not lived a sad life. That was what surprised Eleanor most. The letters were not filled with bitterness. There was no anger, no resentment. Instead, Margaret wrote about gratitude, about seasons, about the beauty of having loved someone, even if life had not allowed them to remain together. One letter in particular stayed with Eleanor. It was written near the end of Margaret's life. A garden is not beautiful because every flower blooms forever. It is beautiful because each season leaves something behind. Some flowers return, some do not, but every bloom has been part of the garden's story. Eleanor closed her eyes. For years, she had thought losing something meant it had failed, a relationship that ended, a person who died, a home that changed, a version of herself that no longer existed. But perhaps loss was not the opposite of love. Perhaps it was proof that something had once mattered. Days later, Eleanor returned to the rose garden with the letters safely stored in the library. The snow had nearly disappeared. Tiny green shoots had begun to emerge from the earth. Winter was beginning to release its hold. Thomas stood beside the old rose bush, examining the branches. She would have liked this, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. Your grandmother? She nodded. The garden, the fact that it survived. Thomas smiled softly. I think she knew it would. Eleanor looked around. The walls, the roses, the paths they had restored together. Everything felt different now. The garden was no longer simply a place from her childhood. It was a place where generations of people had loved, lost, hoped, and continued. A place where unfinished stories had waited patiently. A place where Eleanor was beginning to understand her own. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, Eleanor stood at her bedroom window and looked toward the garden. The roses were still bare. The branches still appeared fragile. But beneath the soil, unseen and quiet, new life was already beginning. And for the first time since returning to Alderwick Manor, Eleanor understood something important. The garden had never been forgotten. It had been carrying its memories all along, waiting for someone to listen. By the time summer returned to Alderwick Manor, the garden no longer resembled the quiet, forgotten place Eleanor had first discovered months before. The transformation had not happened suddenly. There had been no single morning when she stepped outside and found everything restored. Instead, the garden had returned slowly, in the same gentle way that dawn arrives, first with a faint change in the color of the sky, then with a little warmth upon the earth, until one day a person looks around and realizes that the darkness has completely disappeared. The roses bloomed first. Eleanor thought it fitting that they should. The flowers that had carried so many memories, the flowers that had survived winters and years of neglect, were the ones that announced the garden's return. Their petals unfolded along the old stone walls and beneath the wooden arches, filling the air with a fragrance that drifted through the grounds of Alderwick Manor each morning. The garden had remembered how to live, and, in many ways, so had Eleanor. Spring had passed quietly. It had been a season of small discoveries. The fountain at the centre of the garden had been repaired, not restored to its former grandeur, but carefully brought back to usefulness. Thomas had insisted that the old stones should remain exactly as they were. "Every mark tells a story," he had said when Eleanor suggested replacing the weathered pieces. She had laughed. "You say that about everything." Thomas looked at the cracked stone beneath his hand. "Because it is true." She had smiled then. She had come to understand that Thomas saw beauty in things most people overlooked. A weathered wall, a damaged branch, an old garden that others would have considered beyond saving. Perhaps that was why he understood her so well. He did not expect perfection. He only looked for what remained. As the warmer months arrived, Alderwick Manor slowly began to change as well. For years, the house had been quiet, not empty, exactly, but quiet in the way of places where people have stopped gathering. The rooms had been cared for, the fires had been lit, and the windows had been polished, but there had been a certain stillness within the walls. Now, little by little, that stillness faded. The village began to visit again. At first, only a few neighbours came to see the restored garden. Then more followed. Mrs. Holloway prepared tea beneath the old apple tree, placing delicate china cups upon white cloths, while Eleanor arranged flowers from the garden in simple glass vases. There were no grand celebrations, no extravagant parties, only conversations beneath the summer sky, and somehow Eleanor found these gatherings more meaningful than any formal event she had attended in London. People did not come to Alderwick because of its reputation. They came because it felt welcoming, because the garden invited them to stay. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself standing beside the old rose arch, watching children from the village run along the pathways. The sight would have surprised her once. As a child, she had believed grand houses belonged only to the families who owned them. But now she understood something different. A house could belong to more than one person. A garden could belong to everyone who found comfort within it. Thomas approached carrying a basket of freshly cut flowers. "You look thoughtful." Eleanor smiled. "I was remembering something." "What?" She looked around the garden. "When I first arrived here, I thought Alderwick was something I had inherited." Thomas placed the basket down. "And now?" She considered his question. "Now I think it was something I was invited to care for." Thomas looked pleased by the answer. "That is a very gardener's way of thinking." Eleanor laughed softly. "I suppose you have influenced me." Perhaps, he smiled. "You are beginning to answer like me." She shook her head. "I am not sure whether that is a compliment." "It is." The summer evenings became Eleanor's favourite time of day. There was something magical about Alderwick Manor as the sun began to disappear. The heat of the afternoon softened. The shadows grew longer. The garden became filled with golden light, and every flower seemed to hold the last warmth of the day. On these evenings, Eleanor often walked through the rose garden after supper, sometimes alone, sometimes with Thomas. Their conversations were never hurried. They spoke about books, nature, the changing seasons, and the small observations that people often ignored. Thomas told her about distant places he had never visited but hoped to see one day. Eleanor told him about London. about the streets she once loved, and about the loneliness she had felt, even while surrounded by people. "I used to think being surrounded by others meant you could not be lonely," she said one evening. Thomas looked at the roses beside the path. "Many gardens have many flowers," he replied. Eleanor smiled. But some still need sunlight." She looked at him. "You always find a way to make gardening sound like philosophy. Perhaps gardening is philosophy." She laughed quietly, and Thomas smiled because he had come to realize that Eleanor's laughter had become one of the sounds he most loved hearing in the garden. One warm evening in July, Eleanor returned to the library and found the box of her grandmother's letters. She had read them many times since discovering them, but each time she found something new. Not because the words changed, because she had changed. The letters no longer felt like a story about someone else. They felt like a conversation across generations. Her grandmother had once stood in this same garden, carrying her own questions and uncertainties. She had also wondered about love, about duty, about the paths people chose and the paths they left behind. Eleanor placed the final letter back into the box. For years, she had believed her grandmother's story was a tragedy. Now she saw it differently. It was a story of acceptance, of understanding that life rarely unfolded exactly as people imagined. And yet, even imperfect lives could be beautiful. Later that evening, Eleanor found Thomas near the edge of the garden. The sky was painted with the last colors of sunset. The roses around them glowed softly in the fading light. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said. Thomas looked toward the garden. "Yes," she smiled. "I meant the garden. I know." There was a pause, a comfortable silence. The kind that no longer felt like something needing to be filled. "I used to think happiness was something people found," Eleanor said quietly. Thomas looked at her. "And now I think perhaps it is something people create." The words remained between them. Not a promise, not a declaration, just a truth discovered together. As summer continued, Alderwick Manor became known once again as a place of warmth. The garden flourished. The house was filled with voices. The rooms that had once held only memories now held new ones. And Eleanor realized that the greatest gift of returning home was not discovering what had been lost. It was discovering what could still be built. One evening, as she walked through the rose garden beneath the fading summer sky, she paused beside the oldest rose bush, the same rose that had survived all those years. A new flower had bloomed beside it. Two roses growing together, different, yet connected by the same roots. Eleanor touched one of the petals gently. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of her father. She thought of the years she had spent searching for a place where she belonged. And she finally understood. Home was not simply a place where one had memories. Home was a place where new memories were allowed to grow. The garden had taught her that. The seasons had taught her that. And perhaps, without either of them saying so aloud, Thomas had taught her that too. As night settled over Alderwick Manor, the windows glowed warmly against the darkness. The roses released their fragrance into the evening air. The trees whispered softly in the summer breeze. And the old house, which had waited patiently through years of silence, was finally filled once more with life. Not the life it had known before, something gentler, something new, something that belonged entirely to Eleanor. A year had passed since Eleanor Whitmore first returned to Alderwick Manor. When she thought back to that autumn afternoon when the carriage had carried her along the quiet country road toward the old family estate, it sometimes felt as though she were remembering another person's life. the woman who had stepped down from that carriage, had been uncertain. She had carried with her a sadness she rarely spoke about, a weariness that came not from any single hardship, but from years of quietly accepting that certain parts of herself had been left behind. She had returned to Alderwick believing she was coming home to a responsibility. A house, an estate, a collection of memories that belonged more to the past than to the present. But the garden had taught her otherwise. The garden had shown her that some things were not lost. They were simply waiting for the right season. The first morning of spring arrived softly at Alderwick Manor. There was no great announcement of its arrival, no sudden change that could be easily noticed. Instead, it appeared in small ways, the sound of birds returning to the trees, the warmth of sunlight resting longer upon the windows, the scent of fresh earth rising from the garden beds after the first gentle rain. And, most importantly, the roses. Eleanor stood beside the eastern garden wall, watching the first buds begin to open. For a moment, she remembered the day she had found this place. The tangled branches, the forgotten pathways, the silent fountain. The garden had looked as though it belonged to another time. Now, it seemed to belong to every season at once. The old roses still grew along the stone walls, carrying the marks of their years. Some branches were twisted, some flowers were smaller than others, some parts of the garden remained imperfect. But Eleanor no longer believed perfection was the measure of beauty. She had learned better. A garden was beautiful because it endured. Alderwick Manor had changed as well. The house was still old, still filled with memories, still carrying the quiet elegance of generations that had come before. But it was no longer a place where the past seemed heavier than the present. The rooms had become alive again. The library, once filled only with the silence of forgotten books, now held conversations in the evenings. Visitors gathered beside the fireplace, discussing poetry, history, and the simple events of village life. The breakfast room, once prepared only for a few quiet meals, now often carried the sound of laughter. The garden paths, once hidden beneath weeds and fallen leaves, had become places where people walked, talked, and rested. Alderwick had not been restored to what it once was. It had become something new, something perhaps even more precious. A home. Mrs. Holloway often said that Eleanor had brought life back to the manor. But Eleanor always disagreed. "You give me too much credit," she told the housekeeper one morning. They were sitting beneath the apple tree, enjoying tea, while the garden slowly awakened around them. Mrs. Holloway smiled. "Perhaps," Eleanor laughed. "You are beginning to sound like Mr. Ashcombe." The older woman looked amused. "Then perhaps he has taught me something useful." Eleanor glanced toward the garden. Thomas was several yards away, carefully examining a young rose plant that had been transplanted earlier that spring. He had not changed greatly over the past year. He was still quiet, still patient, still more comfortable among flowers than in crowded rooms. But Eleanor had come to understand that quietness was not the absence of feeling. Sometimes it was where the deepest feelings lived. Their relationship had grown slowly. Like the garden, like everything that mattered. There had been no dramatic moment when Eleanor suddenly realized that Thomas had become important to her. No single conversation that changed everything. Instead, there had been countless small moments. A cup of tea left beside her when she was working late in the library. A walk through the garden after a difficult day. A shared smile when they discovered a new flower blooming where they had not expected one. A comfortable silence that felt more meaningful than many conversations. Thomas had never tried to change Eleanor. He had simply reminded her that she did not need to remain the person she had been before. And Eleanor had done the same for him. She had shown him that a quiet life could still include joy, that caring for a garden did not mean one had to remain hidden from the world, that even the most peaceful places deserved to be seen. One afternoon, Eleanor returned to the library and opened her grandmother's journal once more. She had not read it for several months, not because she no longer valued it, but because she no longer needed it in the same way. At first, the journal had been a guide, a connection to a woman she had lost, a way of understanding the mysteries surrounding Alderwick. Now, it was something different. It was simply a treasured reminder. She turned to one of the final pages. The entry was written in Lady Margaret's familiar hand. A garden is never truly finished. Each year brings different flowers, different weather, different challenges. The gardener does not seek to preserve one perfect moment. The gardener simply continues to care, knowing that every season brings something worth discovering. Eleanor smiled. She finally understood. For years, she had been trying to hold on to things that were already gone. Her childhood, her old expectations, the person she believed she was supposed to become. But life was not a garden meant to remain unchanged. It was something living, something always growing. That evening, Alderwick Manor held a small gathering to celebrate the beginning of summer. Nothing grand, nothing like the formal events Eleanor had once attended in London. There were neighbours from the village, friends of the estate, families who had known Alderwick for generations, children who ran happily along the garden paths. The air was filled with music, conversation, and the scent of roses. As the sun began to set, Eleanor stepped away from the gathering and walked alone through the garden. The sky above her turned gold and rose-coloured, the same colour as the flowers surrounding her. She reached the oldest rosebush and stopped. A year ago, it had been the first place where she felt that Alderwick had a story waiting for her. Now, it stood surrounded by new growth. The old rose still bloomed, but around it were many younger flowers. New beginnings growing from old roots. Thomas joined her quietly. "You always come here when you are thinking." Eleanor smiled. "Do I?" "Yes." She looked toward the garden. "I suppose I do." For a while, they stood together without speaking. The evening breeze moved gently through the roses. The manor windows glowed warmly behind them. Everything felt peaceful, not perfect, but peaceful. And Eleanor knew there was a difference. Perfect things often belonged only to imagination. Peace belonged to real life. "I used to think returning here meant facing everything I had lost," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. "And now?" She considered the question. "Now I think I returned here to discover what was still possible." Thomas smiled. The answer seemed to satisfy him. Because perhaps he had always known. Gardens did not exist because nothing ever changed. They existed because everything changed. Because winter always followed summer. Because fallen leaves became nourishment for new growth. Because endings often carried the beginning of something unseen. Years later, people would speak of Alderwick Manor as one of the most beautiful estates in the countryside. They would speak of the roses, of the restored gardens, of the welcoming rooms and the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to surround the old house. But those who knew Eleanor understood that the true beauty of Alderwick was not found in its flowers or its walls. It was found in the story hidden beneath them. A story of patience, of remembrance, of love that survived even when circumstances changed. A story of a woman who returned home believing she had come to restore a garden, only to discover that the garden had been restoring her all along. And every spring, when the first roses opened along the old stone wall, Eleanor would walk through the garden in the quiet morning light. She would pause beside the flowers. She would listen to the birds. She would feel the warmth of the sun upon the earth. And she would remember that everything had its season, every flower, every person, every heart. Some things bloom quickly, some things take years, but with patience, kindness, and care, even the most forgotten garden can bloom again.